Okay, so I'm gonna repeat something I've said in the past, but now add something new to it. So, I've definitely said in the past. I don't know whether it was when you were in yeshiva or not, Gavi, but I feel like it was that one of the most excellent pieces of analysis I've seen about deathbed scenes in Tanakh is from my teacher Moshe Lichtenstein, where he notes that Tanakh has very different deathbed scenes. You have deathbed scenes like Avram, where how many psukim are dedicated to the deathbed scene of Avram? Whatever. A few, right? Like, depends where you want to start the count, right? But not much, right? 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is, right? Depending on how much of that scene you count. On the other hand, like, how many psukim are dedicated to Avram finding a wife for Yitzchak? When you contrast it, right, you're talking 100 plus. So the ratio of his deathbed to the story of getting Yitzchak a wife is astonishing. As opposed to Yaakov, who has quite a long deathbed scene. He gets basically a whole parsha, which is the first time they think he's going to die, the time he's actually dying, the brachot to Ephraim and Menashe, the brachot to the Shvatim, right? Like, the deathbed scene of Yaakov is the lion's share of Parshat Vayechi, right? We're talking almost the whole parsha until you get to Yosef's death. Again, we can quibble about whether you count the psukim about him being embalmed or not, but we're talking a very large section. By far, the longest deathbed scene in all of Torah is who? Moshe, right? Where Moshe, again, we can argue about how much is his deathbed scene. It's the minimum is all of V'zor HaBracha, but a plausible interpretation of the Torah would also be all of Sefer Dvarim, right? Meaning Sefer Dvarim from beginning to end are his speeches in anticipation of his death. So, like, his deathbed scene is pretty long, depending on how much you want to really put in that category. So Rav Moshe said, well, he thinks that the basic difference is between people who end an era or begin an era. Right? People who begin an era, their death is not that important in the grand scheme of things. So Avram is clearly the beginning of a story. Right? Avram is the beginning of the story of the Avot. His death is not so important in that sense. What is important is that he makes sure he has a spiritual heir. And therefore, Avram's deathbed scene gets a few psukim, but the story of him making sure that Yitzchak has a wife to continue the family of Avram and eventually the Jewish people gets hundreds of psukim, because Avram's life is the beginning of a spiritual dynasty. Right? And therefore, the drama in the story is about building a future rather than about him dying. Similar to Avram is what we have in the Haftorah, right? The Haftorah for Parshat Vayechi is David's deathbed scene, and David's deathbed scene is a little bit longer, but it's clearly future focused, right? There isn't so much on David's death as there is on Shlomo. As soon as I die, these are the people I want you to kill. This is what you need to do to make sure that you maintain your kingship, right? It's clear that David's death is more about the establishment of the Davidic dynasty than it is about the death of David per se. And that's, I think, highlighted by the fact that David's death is not at the end of Sefer Shmuel, right? Shmuel is the book which tells about David. David's death should be in Sefer Shmuel if it was about the closing of David's life, but it's not. It's about the opening of Shlomo's dynasty, and therefore it gets put in a separate book. On the other hand, Yaakov and Moshe are the end of an era, right? Moshe, this is obvious. The Torah says as much, right? V'lo kam navi od ki Moshe, right? There would never be another prophet like Moshe who spoke to God face to face, etc. So obviously, the death of Moshe is the end of an era. So his death is important. It gets a whole parsha or a whole sefer, depending on how you want to look at it. Yaakov's death is the same, right? Yaakov is the end of the family of Yaakov and the beginning of the nation of Bnei Israel. And that's why, in many respects, you get the genealogy once in Sefer Breshit and then once again in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. Because first you got to count the 70 people. That was basically the end of the family of Yaakov. But then you get it in Shemot again because that family turns into a nation, which is story number 2 or chapter 2 or act 2 in the play. So we've talked about this before, but what I never really put together, but I think is a really fair point, is that this analysis explains an entirely different midrashic tradition. The midrash in several places, and the Gemara as well, in Bava Metzia Daf Pei Zayin, says that Avram was the first person to ask for aging, right? Until Avram, people just looked young until they died. But Avram wanted to be able to distinguish himself from Yitzchak, so he asked that God bring about aging, right? So that he and Yitzchak might look similar, but one would look old, one would look young. But the Gemara says, what was Yaakov's request for the world? Illness pre-death, right? That people become sick and feeble as their time to leave this world approaches, right? That was Yaakov's request for the world, that people know that they are dying. And again, I got this latter point from Aviva Zornberg, where she points out that what the Gemara is getting at, the Midrashic traditions are getting at, is that Yaakov, building what I just noted from Moshe Lichtenstein, Yaakov goes to great lengths in his deathbed scene to prepare the next generation, right? He calls in Ephraim and Menashe. He promotes them to be Shvatim. He instructs Yosef, how are you going to make sure that I get buried in Eretz Israel? He calls his whole family together. He gives them brachot as individuals. He gives them brachot as a family united. It's clear that Yaakov goes out of his way to make sure that the era that he's ending will be ended properly with the proper tools to start the next stage in Jewish history. And what Aviva Zornberg points out is that the Midrash seems to pick up on this, right? That when the Midrash says that Yaakov asked for illness to come to the world, what they're noting is that Yaakov is the first person in Breshit, or really in the Torah, to have a very systematic plan of how to make sure that his death wraps up a story and begins a new stage in history. And the Midrash's way of saying that is Yaakov requested illness. Yaakov wanted to know when he was dying because he wanted to make sure that he had time to prepare himself and his family for what came next. And I never quite put it together, right? That this insight that Yaakov's death is a huge drama because it's the end of an era seems to be part of what drove Chazal to claim that Yaakov wanted there to be illness so that he would know when he was dying, because that is part of his identity, right? That Yaakov wants to be able to prepare the next generation for what's coming afterwards, and what allows that is not as Midrash says, right? Before Yaakov, people would sneeze and die, right? Yaakov wanted to be sick, right? As much as that's bad, because Yaakov wanted to be able to know, wanted to be able to prepare for the reality that came next. And therefore, again, Chazal's claim that Yaakov requested illness is Chazal's way of saying that Yaakov's personality is the one who doesn't want to just disappear from the world. He wants to have time to prepare the next generation. Therefore, he needs to know that he's dying. That's part of his what's going to take him through to the next generation. And I'll just add that she also notes that this is part of yet another midrashic tradition that's very famous, right? That when Yaakov gathered his sons, right? We talked about this in Tefillah Shir, right? That when Yaakov gathered his sons, he wanted to tell them the end of days, but God hid it from him, right? So he was afraid that his sons weren't worthy. So they said Shema, and he said Baruch Shem, right? That whole story in the Midrash, right? But the fact that the Midrash claims that Yaakov wanted at his deathbed to tell his sons about the end of days further dovetails with this theory that Yaakov is the person who views as part of his final moments in this world his responsibility to shape the future. And therefore he needs to know when he's dying so that he can tell people this is what's coming. Right? And it seems to be that all these midrashic traditions are picking up on Rav Moshe's insight that Yaakov, unlike Avraham and unlike Yitzchak, is obsessed with death and making sure that his death doesn't just quickly go by like Avram's and Yitzchak's, but is a chance for him to plan for the future. And the way Chazal capture that insight is, one, by saying Yaakov requests illness, that he knows he's dying, and two, they pick up on the drama of Yaakov's deathbed of saying, Yaakov is the type of person who wanted to tell his children everything that was going to happen in the future, right? Because that's what you get from this dramatic deathbed scene that you don't have with other people, and therefore Chazal read into his psychology all these different goals during this period of his slow march towards death. Okay. That's it on Yaakov's deathbed, and okay, I assume the next time I give